At the end of the 18th century, Europe was to be shattered not just by the French Revolution, but also by a tremendous cultural movement, a new sense of sensibility, a new mindset, a new style, a new way of writing, and that is Romanticism. Romanticism was truly a pan-European phenomenon. There was a Romanticism in France, a Romantic movement in Britain, in Poland, in Romania. All of Europe was swept by this new movement. We will be looking for some of the meanings of Romanticism, because Romanticism, we tend to think of Romanticism as being just a movement in poetry, but there was also a similar movement in painting, like the painting here by Caspar David Friedrich, but also we speak of romantic politicians like our Bălcescu, who was such a historian. We speak of a romantic turn in social action. So let's see some of those meanings. First, intellectually, Romanticism placed itself contrary to the mindset, the philosophy of the previous age. There were Augustan certainties that dominated the age of the Enlightenment. Everything was orderly, everything was hierarchized. Not by accident, this was the age of the encyclopedia. And the image I used here is meant to illustrate this desire to catalog things, to put them in order, to use reason to explain the visible as well as the invisible. But these now were contested. These now were rejected. And instead of such certainties, now you have emotion. Now you have uncertainty, you have ambiguity. Instead of reason, you have sensitivity. And again, my illustration here is from a painter that could be associated with Romanticism. Turner, a great painter of maritime disasters like this. To move on, politically, Romanticism had also a political component. It's not by accident that Romanticism was to trigger a number of revolutions, a number of movements of social justice all across Europe, probably most notably in Greece, which was at the time dominated by Turkey. So we have these revolutions in France, in Greece, in Poland, in Romania. In Romania you had the Tudor Vladimirescu movement, in Greece you had the Eleftheria movement, and of course these were to be followed half a century later as a direct billiard effect by the 1848 revolution. And such revolutions brought new ideas, like the ideas of a freedom of the nations and freedom of the individual. And they fed a rhetoric of individualism, a rhetoric of human rights, which was also to converge with the work of some of the most important Romantic poets, like Byron, for instance. Then emotionally, Romanticism was first of all about the cult of the self. The previous age, the Augustan age, the Enlightenment, was dominated with projects of the community, projects of the society, and somehow the individual or individualism were left behind. Now the self is asserted, is pushed forward in a manner that makes poets pronounce their own truths without regard to the society, and often in contrast or in clash with society. Stylistically, Romanticism is first and foremost excess. Everything is excessive, intense. Emotion is in excess. Drama is excessive, intense. And all of these are captured in a manner that is also lacking the balance, the harmony, which was a requirement in the poetry and the art of the previous century. So then, stylistically, we should also speak of the role of imagination. imagination had been relegated by the previous age to a region of dubious invention, to the region of superstition, the region of anti-rational conservative traditions, like the folk tradition. And I should say that the discovery of imagination started early in Germany with the discovery of the fairy tale, which were now reinterpreted not just as remains of superstition and obscurantist thought, but as reservoir of extraordinary fantasy and power of imagination. And this happened also in England several decades before the beginning of the Romantic movement, with the works of people like William Blake, an illustrator and a great poet. And you have an example here. But also with the Gothic novel, which unleashed the fears and the dark moods that the previous era of the Enlightenment had tried to keep at bay, to avoid. Socially, the balance of Romanticism is a bit more confusing, because when we speak of social Romanticism, we are trying to look at the social action meant to come after those revolutions and fix the evils of society. If you look at the painters and artists of this age, we see that they have often an ambivalent attitude. On the one hand, they are bent to isolation and pessimism in social matters, but also some of them sport progressive ideals, champion the idea of freedom of nations, for instance, and this is the case of Byron, and this is also the case of Shelley. Aesthetically, the Romantics have a very distinctive attitude to beauty. One very important concept they bring into play, and which was created by John Keats, is the principle of the organic form. Organic form would imply the idea that the content of a poem is the one that has to dictate the form, and not vice versa. One reproach that the Romantics had against the Enlightenment poets was that they were using a rhyme and rhythm and meter and poetic meter in a mechanical form, which was completely insensitive to what was going on at the level of the content in the poem. And now the poem is trying to mold, to adapt its shape, its rhythm to the moods that it expresses. If the mood hastens, then the poem rhythm should become more fast-paced and maybe breathless. If the mood is meditative and solemn, then also the rhythm should slow down, and the euphony of the poem should reflect this. Let's now have a look at the chronology of Romanticism. So this would be a timeline of more than 1 century, as you can see. It begins with 1760, when you begin to have the first Gothic novels and a number of poets which we consider to be pre-Romantic, and we go up to 1840, 1850. So first of all, there are the pioneers of Romanticism, and there is no room for us to put all of them in here. So I'm just going to mention 2 of them. One of them, the Scottish poet Robert Burns, who was active, as you can see by the hump of this green bar represents the moment when he was the most creative and when he published the most. So as you can see, in the late 1780s, he was very active. The other great poet of this age, who lived long enough to see the first Romantics evolve, is the great poet William Blake, very active at the beginning of the century until his death in 1827. There are some other movements that I'm gonna mention a bit later. There would be the Gothic movement, which was very active in the 1760s, 1770s, and there would be the Graveyard School of Poetry about the same time. But then now, as we move to Romanticism proper, you have a first generation of Romantics, which is dominated by 2 figures. There used to be 3. One of them kind of got lost. This is Robert Savage, which is now a forgotten figure of disappointment. And these, they do have something in common. There were poets which had long lives, long enough to change their originally revolutionary, progressive ideals of their youth into a much more conservative stance towards the end of their lives, a reason why they were called the lost leaders. And there is first William Wordsworth, a poet of nature, active beginning with 1797, the year of publication of what is regarded now as being the manifesto of the Romantic movement, the lyrical ballads. And then active in the first years of the century, and then less prolific, kind of rehashing his earlier poems in maturity. His companion and former friend is Samuel Coleridge. Coleridge, who was equally active and to whom we owe some of the most important critical concepts of the Romantics. The second generation of the Romantics were about 20 years younger than these, and they would have a few things in common. They all lived surprisingly short lives, but they did a lot in their short lives. They were outdoor people. They liked to travel. Some of them were exiled. They were, some of them, rather scandalous presences in English life. John Keats, probably the emblem poet of Romanticism, even if he's lesser known in Romania and France. So a poet whose incredibly short life, as you can see, he only lived 36 years, was dominated by a burst of creativity at the end of his life. He's one of the most respected Romantic poets nowadays. And then you have the scandalous, dangerous Lord George Gordon Byron, probably the most prolific of all the Romantics, very active socially, a champion of revolutionary causes in Italy, in Greece, and probably the poet who is the most widely known, especially in France, in Poland, and also in Romania. For many people, Byron is the person that embodies the spirit of Romanticism. And then there is Percy Bysshe Shelley, whom some of you might identify as the husband of Mary Shelley. Again, an interesting poet with an interesting life, also animated by revolutionary ideas. Both him and Byron died abroad in rather tragic circumstances. So this would be the picture of Romanticism, and you can have an idea of who was active and when. Let me just say that when we move later on, we move to the next chapter of our course, which will be the Victorian era. Consider 1837 is the moment when Queen Victoria came to the throne, and that's basically what we consider to be the Victorian era. So the next generation of prose writers we will be dealing with are people who were active in the 1840s and 50s beginning. I'm gonna now highlight very briefly some of the most important people and some of the most important movements, and I'm gonna take them chronologically. And for each of them, I'm going to just highlight a few characteristics, those characteristics that should be remembered, memorized. Before we talk about Romanticism proper, there is something that some people call the pre-Romantic movement or pre-Romanticism. It's a very loose definition, and because you don't have clear memberships in this movement. Many of the people we are mentioning here had been identified, obviously, as pre-Romantics much later. So this happened probably between 1760 and 1790. And this is not a coherent movement. It consists of individuals, it consists of several threads, of several trends that just happen to coexist. What we should have in mind is that we should look at pre-Romanticism not as a movement whose only aim was to prepare Romanticism, obviously. It's not a movement without merit. Some, of course, tend to regard pre-Romanticism as being some sort of a rehearsal, of a preparation of Romanticism proper. And they tend to devaluate or to dismiss the poetry of these people as something minor and less important. It is true that in comparison with the Romantics, they do pale a bit. So their experience seems less accomplished. But I think we can also regard them by looking in another way, by looking at the age that they are putting an end to, and that is the Augustan age. So these are people who are, let me say so, with one foot in the Augustan age, in the Enlightenment, dominated by reason, and the other foot in Romantic waters, dominated by sensitivity and emotion and unbalance. So in other words, they might be read also in another key as poets who begin to doubt the certainties of the Enlightenment. Poets that, in terms of chronology, of life chronology, they do belong to the Augustan age, to the Enlightenment, but they do begin to express doubts, uncertainty, sadness, a feeling of isolation, a feeling of sadness and regret about the transience of the world. So let's see who are these groups. So we should have first the graveyard school of poetry. A movement, a very heterogeneous movement, a movement of different poets such as Thomas Gray, Robert Blair, William Cowper, who earned this name because of a poem by Thomas Gray, which is entitled Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard. A poem that is kind of iconic for this group of people because it's a poem which is written in a way along the lines of the biblical idea of everything is vanity. But actually it gives less of a philosophical echo and more of a personal touch. This poet walks about churchyard in the countryside and becomes painfully aware of the fact that what he sees there under those headstones are people who used to have lives, people who used to have desires, and who are all of them now gone. And the poet reacts to this not with the stoic indifference of the philosopher, but with participation and with empathy and with emotion and with an incredible sadness. So, and of course, not everybody in this group wrote about graveyards, obviously. This label stuck just because it was kind of memorable. Blair, for instance, wrote a long poem about the bard on top of the mountain set in hazy medieval or pre-medieval times. Cowper wrote rather melodramatic poems. There is another guy, Thompson, who wrote a cycle of poems about the seasons. And he speaks of the seasons in a manner that no longer describes the seasons in a calendar or almanac-like mode as others did before him, no longer looking at seasons from the point of view of the farmer or the shepherd, but looking at them with a more personal emotion and involvement. Another group here would be that of Celtic bardic poetry. And this is mainly represented by Macpherson. Macpherson, again coming from Scotland, has a very interesting story. Sometime in this period, he published a collection of poems which he claimed to have been discovered by him as manuscripts written in the old Celtic language called Erse. And he published this volume, Fingal, Relics of Ancient Poetry, in his own translation. Massive volume, hundreds of lines that he translated. And this volume was phenomenally popular all over Europe. It started a craze for ancient manuscripts, pre-Christian manuscripts. And among others, the great poet Goethe was enthusiastic about it. And everybody was raving about this. And then Macpherson announced that he found another manuscript and that he's going to translate from this as well. He translated this suspectly quickly and published it even more suspiciously quickly. And then some philologists, historians started to express doubts and suspicions about this, and they challenged Macpherson to produce the originals because everybody wanted to see the originals of those extraordinary poems. The funny thing, when Macpherson was cornered by these guys, he could not produce anything. And why, you might have guessed? Because he had invented everything. There were no original manuscripts. He had invented those heroic poems about Finn, and he created them single-handedly. He created this genre of the fake heroic epic poem in translation. Of course, his personal reputation was destroyed by such revelation, but the passion or the interest in such concoctions, in such inventions remained. And it started a trend that will become a component of Romanticism, an interest in the past, an interest in an idealized, remote past that is so difficult to equate. A past of valiant heroes and cast damsels and extraordinary feats of arms. And this was to be continued in the Romantic era by one of the few Romantic prose writers, Sir Walter Scott, again from Scotland, who was the inventor of the historical novel in England and the co-inventor of the historical novel in Europe alongside with Alexandre Dumas in France. And one of the key ideas in Walter Scott, an idea that he took from Macpherson, was the idea that the past was nobler, more valiant, it had more values than the present. You also find this idea, if you remember, in Eminescu, in his poem Epigoni, where the comparison between the heroic and valuable past and the undignified present is constant, and it is expressed mostly as looking at the poets and the artists of the time. Another trend is an interest in the old heroic ballads, as manifested in Thomas Percy's collection of 1765 entitled Relics of Ancient English Poetry, consisting of old heroic ballads, songs, and other pieces of earlier poets. The interest in the folk ballad was very large at the beginning of the Romantic era, the Romantic movement. Let us not forget that the first poetry collection published, which is commonly regarded as the manifesto of the Romantic movement, was entitled Lyrical Ballads. And the interest in the ballad came both as an interest in the tradition, unadulterated, unsoiled traditions of the pure, innocent folk people, but also an interest in the form of the ballad, a form that is poem in verse, but with a story, with an epic narrative. And also an interest in the kind of meter, rather simple, unsophisticated meter, simple tropes, rhyming or non-rhyming. Most ballads actually do not have a rhyme, they rely mostly on the rhythm. And this is something that really inspired the Romantics, who would from time to time use the verse form in a narrative form. The champions of these would be Coleridge and mostly Byron. And then there is another trend represented by Chatterton, that of pseudo-medieval poetry. This is poetry which was written again as a fake simulacrum of old poetry. Chatterton himself became a model for many. Chatterton died very young. He died on his bed, surrounded by manuscripts, an image that fed the imagination of many in the public. There is a famous painting of him which was painted about 100 years later, and it just made his myth go on. I'm saying here that Chatterton contributed himself to this cult of the past, cult of the noble past, which we saw before. But his life, and especially his death, make him the prototype of the poet maudit, of the damned poet, the poet misunderstood by society, who dies for his art alone and misunderstood. Among the pioneers of Romanticism, which would be our second category here, these are people that you might associate formally with Romanticism, even if they are not commonly considered to be romantic. The first figure would be Robert Burns, a poet coming from Scotland, who is now regarded as Scotland's national poet. he was in a way unambitiously writing poems that didn't claim to be cultivated artifacts, but they tried to mimic the form of the songs. Some of them are narrative, some of them are lyrical. These are images from some of his poems in which you encounter imagery and creatures from Celtic folklore. Another important pioneer of Romanticism is William Blake. William Blake, 1757-1827, is a complex figure. We'll have a chance to discuss him in more detail. He was a multi-talented person. He was a poet, he was an engraver, a graphic artist, but he was also a printer who wanted to have full control of the form of his poems in every detail, beginning with a layout and ending with an illustration. He's the author of widely admired Songs of Innocence and Experience, which is a 2-volume work consisting of Songs of Innocence, which are mostly about childhood, and Songs of Experience, which are about the disillusions of the adult age. Here's an example of a page from Songs of Innocence and Experience, a famous poem by him entitled The Tiger. As you can see here, Blake is mingling, is mixing, blending his own illustrations with handwritten text, and everything is blending. Even the colors of the text blend in with the images of this poem, which is an attempt of asking or wondering how could or who could make such a beautiful beast as a tiger, beautiful symmetry, a dangerous and yet fascinating image. And obviously this is a questioning of God's intentions. Now let's move to the first generation of Romantics. This is the generation that emerged in the last years before the turn of the century, and the first person we mentioned here is William Wordsworth, a long-lived poet who was born in 1770, died in 1850, and he's the co-author of the lyrical ballads, as I said earlier, written together with his good friend Samuel Taylor Coleridge. And he's also the author of some longer poems, many of them lying in an unfinished condition, maybe because Wordsworth had huge ambitions about writing some kind of enormous, highly structured, almost architectonic poem with many parts of which he was able to finish just a few. Part of the prelude is something that later was published as an independent volume, Intimation of Immortality from Recollections of Childhood, a poem that probably for the first time redefines childhood not as a transient phase of moving towards adulthood, but as a wonderful, fascinating age in itself, an age in which as a child you are closer to divinity than you would ever be later on. Wordsworth was a poet of nature, and he is praised for his landscape accuracy. He wrote about landscapes in the northern part of England, the so-called Lake District, and some people even call his poetry topographic because it's very easy sometimes to identify hills or peaks or mountains or lakes which are depicted in his poetry in a manner that makes them easily identifiable. Wordsworth also praised the authenticity of personal experience. Everything he wrote, he insisted it was based on his own emotions, on his own sensations, whether visual or tactile or auditive. One famous phrase by him is, "The child is father to the man," which could be understood as expressing the idea that childhood is a divine state and it's the repository of adults' values, and children know better. This is a very interesting phrase that was to have extraordinary consequences because it was to influence the very way childhood, not only childhood but also youth, were valued. We could safely say that Wordsworth launched the idea that maybe in some areas young people know it better, and they have qualities that we will be losing later in life. He's also a poet of marginals, and by marginals we might understand the poor, the impoverished, like this person living by a ruined cottage that he had lost because a new law that made bankrupt a lot of former landowners. It also includes the very old. It includes people who are senile, or even people with mental troubles, like the idiot boy. There is a great outpouring of sympathy that Wordsworth shows to these neglected people. A second figure of the first generation of Romantics is Samuel Taylor Coleridge, 1772, 2 years younger than Wordsworth, who died in 34. A very different character. The two of them were friends, but they couldn't be more different. Whereas Wordsworth was organized, was calm, contemplative, Coleridge had a wild imagination that sometimes he had trouble mastering, and he also experimented with fantasy. So Coleridge is the author of several poems, but probably the most popular of them is The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, a long ballad-like form. And Kubla Khan is a poem that remained in literary history just because it was never finished. It was written during a phase in which Coleridge had taken some drugs, and he wrote a bit of the poem, and then he was unable to finish it after he had woken up, and he left the poem like that, just like a ruin of a poem. Coleridge pioneered several trends himself, and we see him as a poet of the supernatural and fantasy, and he considered imagination to be the greatest of a poet, the greatest riches a poet can have, and that should be cherished. He probably also had a little anxiety, a little fear that he might lose that imagination, that power of imagination. He's also a literary theorist, exposing his ideas in a book that has a misleading title, Biographia Literaria, which is by no means a biography, it's just a treatise of literary theory. And there he distinguishes between primary imagination, which is creative, demiurgic, versus secondary imagination, which is mere fancy, which doesn't contribute anything substantial to the world. Inspiration, Coleridge thinks, is irrational and unfathomable. You cannot reach its bottom ever. And in this respect, he's obviously the very opposite of the poets of the Augustan era, like Alexander Pope. He's also an artist of the doomed genius, because this is one possible interpretation we could have of his rather cryptic poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. As a literary theorist, he also created the idea of the organic form, which I mentioned earlier, the idea that the structure of a work of art and its style has grown naturally from the author's subject. So there shouldn't be any kind of clash, any kind of contrast or mismatch between form and content. And probably ideally we shouldn't even discuss form and content as two different entities. The second generation of Romantics is dominated in public recognition by the figure of John Keats, born in 1785, who died in 21. And he's the poet, as I said, with the best reputation today. His reputation never sank, never faltered. And he wrote, and this is absolutely exceptional, he wrote most of his poems in the 16 months of the so-called Annus Mirabilis, the wonderful year, which was the period of his last months just before he died by tuberculosis at the age of 36. His poems are poems of harmony and balance, and in this respect he's a bit unlike the other Romantics. Some critics even argue that he might be the least romantic of the Romantics if you follow the general definition of Romanticism, which places unbalance and excess as hallmarks, keywords of Romanticism. And this is visible in his cult for ancient Greece, which made a critic, Webb, to speak of his romantic Hellenism. This is very visible in a note on a Grecian urn. His Greece is a bit like the Greece of Novalis, the German poet, is a very clear-sighted, calm, serene land, imaginary, almost imaginary land. He's also the author of pseudo-medieval poems, like the Eve of St. Agnes, poems in which he recreated Middle Ages ambience, not just the architecture, but also the interior decoration, the objects, the people. And in a way, we can regard him as a continuator of the cult for the Middle Ages, which was opened by the Gothic writers, such as Walpole or Radcliffe. His other major contribution is that of aestheticism, his belief in the supreme value and power of beauty. Beauty with a capital B. Beauty is supreme. Beauty is also ethical. So in terms of aesthetic categories, beauty and morality are joint, are the same. And this is visible in his Ode on a Grecian Urn or in his Ode to a Nightingale. In his poems, very often there is synesthesia. If you don't remember, this is the mingling of the senses, the translation of the sensations acquired through one sense in the vocabulary of the other sense. So mingling sight, hearing, smell, like in some beautiful lines from his iconic poem, The Eve of St. Agnes. And also interesting is that he's more interested in the so-called lower senses, inferior senses, the senses that are not commonly celebrated by poets and philosophers, the smell, taste, and touch. Keats also manifested extraordinary empathy with all the animate and inanimate world, with creatures like birds, but even with inanimate things. Like there is a wonderful line in his diary in which he says something like, I can imagine myself taking part in the life of a billiard ball and being full, being happy of my own roundness and smoothness and swift motion. There is also something that has to do with his personal circumstances. Keats realized rather early that he was doomed to die young. TB, tuberculosis, at the time would give some signs, a bloody cough that would be the telling signs of imminent death. So his poems are colored by his sorrow and regret, but also by his tragic acceptance of what was going to happen. So death is imminent, it mingles with love. And the beauty of the world should be celebrated even more as it doesn't last, as it's transient and passing. As a literary theorist, Keats launched a highly unusual, almost bizarre concept of the chameleon poet. The poet, he said, is like a chameleon. The poet has to mold, to mimic, to adapt the shape of his environment. He has to take part in the environment and be what that environment is. And another interesting concept he launched is that of negative capability. Again, a surprising and paradoxical concept, because why would capability be negative? When would it be negative? And this is his way of suggesting that we shouldn't be afraid of uncertainty. We shouldn't be afraid of the unknown and the mystery, but rather we should embrace them, embrace ambiguity, mystery, uncertainty. George Gordon Byron, the fifth Lord of Byron, 1788-1825, was probably the most iconic and visible of the Romantic poets. And this is owed to his scandalous life, to his having had numerous lovers of both sexes, of him being forced to live in exile, spending time in Italy and Greece. On the positive side, we should mention that Byron also remained in the collective memory of people in Greece and Italy as championing the cause of freedom. He championed the cause of a free and unified Italy at a time when the north part of Italy was still under Austrian rule, and he even cooperated with a Carbonari anarchist or revolutionary movement. And in Greece, he financed a whole regiment of soldiers that were to fight later on, unhappily just after he died, against the Turk oppressors. Byron was also the author of long narrative poems. Most of his poems were verse dramas on historical themes. And in this respect, Byron brought to perfection a new genre, a combination of drama and verse. Most of his verse dramas are very difficult to stage because they're very long and kind of rhetorical. Critics today tend to prefer the later Byron, who had overcome the rather melodramatic tendencies in his early poetry. He used irony and even sarcasm in many of his later poems. Byron could also be regarded as the person who invented or created Byronism, a pan-European cultural phenomenon that caught everywhere, especially in France, and which led to the confusion between Byron's personal life and Byron's fictional persona as projected in his numerous male characters. These male characters are those that came to be known as the Byronic heroes, and they are characterized by their dark past. They are not necessarily handsome, they are secretive, magnetic, erotic, and often macho and heroic. Exoticism is another important component in his poetry, especially as for his time, Byron himself had traveled to very far off lands such as the Levant, Turkey, Albania, and he used them as backdrops of his poems. Alongside with exoticism, there is his eroticism. He's a teller of impossibly doomed love stories, and often with suggestions of non-conventional eroticism. He's often used historical settings that are recognizable, especially in his historical dramas, such as Renaissance Venice, pre-modern Greece, or the Old Orient. And then through his poems, but even more through his live action, he represented the fight for liberty of the oppressed nations of Europe. Percy Bysshe Shelley, the last poet of the second generation of Romantics, known to many as the husband to Mary Shelley, which is a bit ironic because she was less visible in the period than he was, also had a rather unhappy end. He died drowned during a boat expedition in Italy, in the Lerici Bay. And his funeral was even more romantic because there was a scare of plague in those places at the time. So his body was laid ashore, put on a stake, and he was burned like, a Viking funeral. Shelley was a good verse craftsman, and some people even claim that this was his only talent. He was quite good with rhymes, with rhythm, and often some claim he allowed the movement of his verse carry him away and kind of made him digress. His inspiration, the same critics suggest, was rather disorderly. Poems were sometimes rambling or maybe overlong. However, on the positive side, Shelley had an extraordinary sense for nature's dynamism, as it can be seen in a poem we will be studying, The Cloud, which is an extraordinary capturing of nature's versatility and endless cycles. Shelley, too, embraced political causes and announced the imminent revolution, the revolution of 1848, in a memorable ode to the west wind, where the west wind, as you probably know, is the wind whose blowing in the spring or in late winter announces the coming of spring. And of course, metaphorically, spring equals revolution here. Let's have a look now at the main features of English Romanticism. I would suggest you wouldn't rush when you discuss English Romanticism, and you shouldn't try to expand onto it or to extrapolate towards it the characteristics of Romanian Romanticism. There are important differences. It would be enough to say that our Romanticism was imported mainly through a French and partially German thread and British Romanticism is a class of its own. And the British Romantics had features that other lacked, and vice versa. For instance, German Romanticism had a very important component involving the celebration of folklore and of the fairy tale. Many regard the work of the brothers Grimm as being fueled by the ideals of Romanticism. But not so in England. There is no such interest in the fairy tale with the British Romantics. So let's have a look at some of the overall tendencies. And I'm not going to mention names so much, but rather general ideas. First of all, as we saw earlier, a very important thing in Romanticism is that it rejects the Augustan notions of rationality, of common sense, and of order. And I placed here two images that are, well, not necessarily Augustans. One of them is actually from the Renaissance, but they give you an idea of how orderly the structure of the world appeared to these people. And as you can see on the left, you have a hierarchy that goes from the mineral order to plants and animals, and then humans, and heaven, angels, and God. And similarly, also on the image on the right, you have a similar hierarchy with mineralia, vegetabilia, animalia, and so on and so forth. So the world was orderly. It was the poets and the scientists' aim to know it, to acknowledge it. Another characteristic of the Romantics is the cultivation of this new sensibility. A sensibility of the poet which is often at odds with the world, a poet that is listening to his heart, that might be impulsive, that is not always listening to the voice of reason, a poet which is prone to excess, to unbalance, to errors, but these errors are celebrated and regarded with interest. There is, of course, a certain feminine sensitivity in Romanticism, a certain attention to lowly things like plants and animals, or to transient phenomena, the splendor of the dawn, the wonders of the night, and so on and so forth. There is an increasing interest in nature in the Romantics, and probably it starts with their own lifestyle. Most of the Romantics were outdoor people. Coleridge and Wordsworth had moved out of the crowded cities to rent some cottages in the Lake District up north, and they took long walks in nature and experienced all the moods and the whims of nature. The second generation of Romantics, Keats and Shelley and Byron, they were avid sportsmen, I could say. They liked to hike in the mountains. Byron was a very good swimmer despite a disability he had. And so was Shelley, who liked boat trips and hiking again. So all these brought them close to nature, not an abstract nature as you could see in the previous generation, but a nature full of memorable sights and almost topographical detail. Their interest in landscapes, in scenery, goes towards, again, another type of landscape. The landscapes that are wild, untamed, rugged seas like this one, choppy sea, choppy waves, ragged mountains, crags and precipices, and they made a discovery of the Alps. They made the discovery of beautiful sites in the Lake District. Voila, this is illustrated on the right with another image by the same Caspar David Friedrich, the German artist who painted images like this of solitary walkers, solitary people in the mountains at a time when there were very few tourists out there. It was an expensive pastime. Something we almost take for granted in Romantic poetry is this association between the human moods with the moods and whims of nature. A tragedy, a personal tragedy, is often doubled with a tempest. Happiness is paralleled with nature's more serene moods, a beautiful sunset or a serene, glorious sky. There is a very interesting attitude about religion. The Romantics have an emphasis on what would be called natural religion. It's not that they are atheists, even if at least two of them had renounced organized religion and adhered to other forms of belief, such as pantheocracy. They probably regarded the church as an institution with a deep distrust and tried to imagine that divinity could be experienced in all manifestations of nature. Something akin to pantheism, the Greek phenomenon of pantheism, belief that God and the divinity are present not necessarily in temples and churches and in sanctuaries, but in nature. There is then an emphasis on the need of spontaneity in thought and action and in literary expression. Being spontaneous, even if this means expressing oneself in a less smooth manner, maybe with interruptions, maybe with gaps, is better than writing in a very polished manner. So it's almost like you have with them this anti-calophilia that many years later Camille Petrescu was to speak about. They are distrustful of the verse that is too smooth, too balanced, and they think a poet should only write when he gets inspiration, and he should do it with utmost sincerity and spontaneity. We have something that probably this is quite a major connector with our own Romanian Romanticism, this belief in the natural genius. Some people have a genius of imagination, a genius of projecting their spirit onto the world. And that natural genius is not to be harnessed. You can't guess when the next genius will appear. It's almost a natural phenomenon. And together with it, what the natural genius brings is his or her extraordinary power of imagination. Imagination is in itself a value. Imagination doesn't mean rambling or beating about the bush or being digressive or being untrustworthy. Their belief is that imagination adds something to the world, and that's why poetic geniuses are important. And of course, such geniuses are generally misregarded, misfit in society, and they tend to be at odds, in clash with society. The image I added here, it's not an image of a romantic poet, but I would say it's an image that brings a romantic touch to a much older writer. This is from the movie entitled Shakespeare in Love, in which the film director is trying to project Shakespeare as a romantic character, I would say, and it could really well illustrate what we were saying here. The individual, the cult of the individual, the exaltation of the individual and his needs is central to Romanticism, and it's connected to the idea of personal freedom. The individual should have the courage to break his chains to society when society is holding him down. And this is what some of these artists really did in various ways. Probably, again, we have to look at Byron. Had a castle, was noble, he had a position in the House of Lords, and yet when he felt British society was holding him down, he abandoned England and he permanently moved abroad in order to experience this personal freedom. I would add here the cult of the noble savage. The noble savage is a notion I think we mentioned a bit in passing when we discussed the figure of Friday in Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe. The noble savage, or le bon sauvage as the French call him, is a person who was spared of the transformative force of education and formal civilization. So he remained at the edge of society. He's either a primitive person, between inverted commas, or an inhabitant of a remote nation at the edge of civilization. But he could also be a child or a very simple person at the edge of industrial society, like, I don't know, a peasant, or maybe someone who lost his mind, or maybe someone who is, senile. And the cult of the noble savage is visible here and there, especially in this celebration of marginals, which we saw happening in Wordsworth. It's a cult that, in a way, is dynamite to the beliefs about the individual in religion, because they are suggesting that people are born noble. Even if you're not civilized, even if you're not baptized, you are not educated, people's lives are valuable and they mean something and they need to be respected. I would add this feature which we mentioned earlier, the contrast between the noble past and the ignoble present. The past is glorious, but the present doesn't match, doesn't rise to the stake. There is a lot of cult of the ruins in the pre-Romantics, and it was sometime continued by the Romantics proper. And I would add also, because I guess a lot of you would interpret romantic as meaning love or having to do with love. This is because our current vocabulary is using romanticism in a more special sense. Yeah, we speak of a romantic relation or romantic interest in someone, and we mean erotic. And I would say that the Romantics kind of oscillated between an interest in sensuous love versus an interest in spiritual love. So that remains kind of undecided. Some of the Romantics have highly sensuous poems. Keats does that quite a lot, and also Byron. But very often the erotic tension remains unresolved, sometimes because the love is doomed and cannot be accomplished. And this is my personal, let's say my personal take, my personal interpretation. In my view, maybe the key feature in Romanticism, and it's probably a feature that you would encounter in all manners, all types of Romanticism across Europe, is this bipolar vision of the world, this contrast between the demonism and angelism, demons and angels. Venere și Madonna, as you remember, were the two opposite images of feminine in Eminescu. And I think this is manifest everywhere in Romantic poetry. Of course, it leads to maybe an oversimplification and an over-tensioning of the image of the world that these people have, but I think it's quite central to their art. Some features I'm gonna mention here are a bit more, not marginal, but they are restricted to some Romantic actors. And one of them would be exoticism, this interest in the remote. I would say that the interest in exoticism is in fact an interest in the other, with a capital O, in otherness. So the other that kind of negates our identity, but maybe it also helps better understand our own identity. And we could see exoticism very highly at work in Byron. Byron's early poems were mostly highly exotic love tales. The principle of the organic form, which we mentioned earlier, also led to a curiosity about other forms of poetry, a curiosity about exotic forms of poetry. And we have Romantic poets discovering the haiku, Persian poetry, or even Icelandic poetry, or, as we could see earlier, the poetry of the bards of the pre-medieval times. So that would be my presentation of Romanticism in a brief, mentioning all of the important features and the few facts about each of their actors. Thank you.